Great. Here's part one of the story, written in a simple, engaging, and human-centric tone, suitable for narration or adaptation into video. It's around 1,400 words and avoids any violent or policy-violating content, keeping it natural and emotionally impactful. The courtroom was cold that morning. Not the kind of cold from the air conditioning, but a coldness that sat in the air, a silence that spoke louder than words. The room was filled with murmurs, people waiting for their names to be called. At the front, the judge sat behind the bench, flipping through papers with a bored look on his face. Then the door opened. A young boy, no older than 17, walked in wearing a slightly oversized suit. The collar didn't sit quite right, and the sleeves were just a bit too long. He didn't have a tie, just a plain white shirt buttoned to the top. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and two officers walked closely behind. He looked around nervously, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. His mother wasn't in the room. She had been working a double shift and couldn't get the time off. He was alone, except for the court-appointed lawyer who hadn't said more than 3 words to him since they met that morning. The judge glanced up. "This the car theft case?" he asked, not looking directly at the boy. "Yes." "Your Honor," one of the officers replied. The judge let out a short laugh, not the kind you laugh when something is funny, but the kind that says you've already made up your mind. "He doesn't even look old enough to drive," the judge said, flipping a page. "What's next?" "He's going to tell us he's a future attorney?" The courtroom chuckled. A few people laughed out loud, and someone in the back muttered something under their breath. The boy heard it, but he didn't turn around. He just kept looking at the floor. The judge noticed the silence from the boy. "Nothing to say?" he asked. "Not even a word?" The boy looked up slowly. "No, sir," he said quietly. The judge shook his head. "Figures," he said almost to himself. The public defender, a tired-looking man with bags under his eyes, stood up and shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to the charges. We ask that bail be set at a reasonable amount." The judge didn't even flinch. "Denied," he said flatly. "Flight risk." "But, Your Honor," the lawyer began. "That's final." The judge cut him off. The boy's shoulders dropped slightly, but he didn't say a word. He just stood there, hands cuffed, eyes steady. As the officer led him back out, the judge leaned back in his chair and mumbled, "Maybe next time, wear a real suit." The boy heard that too, but he didn't react. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just walked step by step down the hallway and back toward the holding cell. Inside, his heart was racing, but his face didn't show it. He had learned a long time ago not to let people see what he was feeling. That was the first thing he taught himself. Control your emotions, or they'll control how people treat you. He sat on the bench in the holding area and closed his eyes. This wasn't the first time he'd been misunderstood. People saw his skin, his age, his clothes, and they drew their own conclusions. What they didn't know was everything else. They didn't know he spent more time at the public library than at the basketball court. They didn't know he'd been reading about law since he was 12. They didn't know he carried a small, worn notebook in his backpack filled with legal terms, courtroom sketches, and questions he hoped to one day ask in a real courtroom. But this wasn't how he imagined his first time in court would go. He always dreamed of standing behind the defense table, wearing a clean suit with his own case notes and clients who believed in him. He never thought he'd be the one in handcuffs, laughed at by a judge who didn't know his name, who didn't care to. The charges against him were false. He knew it. The car that had been stolen belonged to someone in his neighborhood, and when the police arrived, they saw him walking nearby and decided he fit the description. No witnesses. No fingerprints. No camera footage. Just a hunch, and that hunch landed him in a holding cell, waiting to be tried as an adult for something he didn't do. The next day in court, things weren't much better. His public defender barely looked at the file. "They don't have much," he muttered. "We'll try to work out a deal." The boy looked at him. "I don't want a deal." "I didn't do anything," the lawyer sighed. "Sometimes it's better to take a deal than risk a worse sentence." "But I'm innocent," the boy said firmly. The lawyer didn't respond. He just tapped his pen against the table and kept reading. When the court was back in session, the judge was again quick with the jokes. "So, future attorney," he said with a smirk, "still think you're too smart for this courtroom?" The boy stood up straight. "I never said that, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Oh, he speaks. The courtroom laughed again. The boy felt the sting of it all, but he didn't flinch. He just took a deep breath and stood still. The prosecutor listed the charges. They sounded heavy, more than he even realized. Grand theft auto, resisting arrest, suspicion of tampering. None of it made sense, but it was all listed under his name. Do you have anything to say? The judge asked again. The boy opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't sure what he was allowed to say. He wasn't sure if anything he said would matter, but he looked the judge in the eye. I didn't do it, he said. I was walking home from the library. The judge leaned forward. From where? The library, he repeated. The judge chuckled. Sure. You were doing research for law school, right? The boy didn't respond. He just nodded. The judge's laughter stopped. You're serious? Yes, the boy said. That's what I want to do. There was a pause in the courtroom. Not because people believed him, but because they weren't sure what to make of him. A boy in handcuffs talking about becoming a lawyer. It didn't fit the story they were telling in their heads. The judge shook his head. We'll see how long that dream lasts, he said, banging his gavel. Court was adjourned. The boy was taken away again, but this time, something had changed. Not in the courtroom, but in him. He realized he couldn't wait for someone to believe in him. He would have to prove it. Not through loud words or... Got it. Here is part 2 of the story, written in a simple, natural, and human-centered tone. It continues from part 1, keeping the story engaging and YouTube-friendly, without any AI-sounding language or inappropriate content. It's easy to judge someone when you don't know their story. That was the case with the young man who stood in court, quiet and serious, while people around him laughed. What most of them didn't know was where he came from, or what it took just to make it there that day, standing tall even while the world tried to shrink him. He grew up in a neighborhood where people were used to being overlooked. The streets had more liquor stores than libraries, more broken promises than open doors. But in the middle of all that, there was a small apartment on the second floor of an old brick building where he lived with his mother and younger sister. His father had left when he was still in diapers, and from that point on, it was just the 3 of them. His mother was a strong woman. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices in the morning and working at a diner at night. She never complained, but he saw how tired she was when she came home. Some nights she would sit on the edge of the bed, still in her uniform, and rub her sore feet before she even thought about dinner. Even though they didn't have much, she always made sure he and his sister had clean clothes, full stomachs, and hope. School wasn't easy. Not because he couldn't keep up. He was actually ahead of most of the kids in his class, but because people didn't expect much from him. Teachers often looked past him, calling on other kids, not bothering to challenge him. When he raised his hand too often, they told him to give others a chance. When he got bored and stopped trying, they said he didn't care. It was hard to win, still he kept going. What made the difference was something small but powerful: the public library. It was only 6 blocks from his apartment, and it became his second home. The librarian there, an older man with thick glasses and a quiet voice, noticed how often he came in. After a while, he started saving books for him, books about science, history, and law. The first time he read about the justice system, he was only 11. The book wasn't meant for kids, but he understood enough to feel something shift in him. It talked about trials, rights, lawyers, and judges. It also talked about people who were treated unfairly because of how they looked, where they lived, or the color of their skin. That hit home. He started asking more questions. He wanted to know how laws worked, how people defended others in court, and why the system didn't always seem fair. He didn't know it then, but a dream was starting to grow in him. A dream to be one of those people who stood up for the truth, no matter what. By the time he was 13, he had read more about the Constitution and civil rights than most adults. He could quote famous cases, knew how to break down legal arguments, and even started writing mock speeches in a notebook he carried around. His friends didn't always get it, but they respected it. Some even asked him for help when they got in trouble at school. At 14, something happened that made everything even more real. His older cousin was arrested. It wasn't for anything serious, just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, hanging out with the wrong crowd. But the way the police handled it left a mark. No explanation, no questions, just cuffs and a cold ride downtown. When his cousin finally got out, he was quieter. Angry but tired. He didn't want to talk about it much. That made him even more determined. He started spending time after school at a local community center that had free legal aid services. At first, he just helped organize papers and make copies. But once the lawyers there saw how sharp he was, they let him sit in on meetings, even teaching him how to read case files and court transcripts. He soaked it all up like a sponge. The people who worked there were different from what he had seen on TV. They weren't rich or wearing expensive suits. They were regular people trying to help others who didn't have money or power. That made him believe he could do it too. He didn't need to be perfect, he just needed to care, to be smart, and to keep going. And that's what he did. Still, life had a way of testing him. Just because he had goals didn't mean the world made it easy. There were nights when he had to study by candlelight because the power got cut off. Mornings when he skipped breakfast so his sister could eat. Days when he wanted to quit, to just be a kid, to not carry so much. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered what he saw around him. Good people stuck in bad situations, not because they were lazy or careless, but because the system wasn't built for them. That gave him fuel. He wasn't just working for himself. He was working for them too. The day he was arrested was one of the hardest of his life. He wasn't guilty. It was a case of mistaken identity, but the officers didn't care. They threw him in the back of a police car without listening. At the station, he asked for a lawyer. They laughed, said he watched too much TV. When he tried to explain his rights, they told him to be quiet. He wasn't scared for himself. He was scared that all his hard work, all his late nights, all the things he had overcome would be erased by one bad moment. That people would only see him as a number, a mugshot, a case file. When he sat in that courtroom and heard the judge laugh at him, it felt like everything he had feared was coming true. That no matter how hard he tried, they would never see him for who he really was. But he stayed calm, not because he wasn't angry, but because he knew losing control wouldn't help. What they didn't know was that he had prepared for this moment his whole life. He knew the law better than they expected. He knew the truth. And deep down, he believed it would come out, one way or another. He wasn't the kind of person to give up just because someone in a robe didn't believe in him. He had already come too far. Would you like me to continue with part 3 next? Here is part 3 of your story, crafted in the same style. Simple, natural, and engaging. The courtroom was tense, but the young man stayed quiet for a long time, letting the noise around him settle. The public defender assigned to him seemed tired, distracted, and ready to get through the case quickly. She barely looked at the evidence, barely spoke up. It was clear she didn't believe he was innocent. But then something unexpected happened. A woman stepped forward. She wasn't from the usual team, but had heard about the case through a local community group. She was a lawyer who volunteered her time for people who couldn't afford one. She believed in second chances and the truth. When she asked the judge if she could take over the case, there was a murmur in the room. The judge looked her up and down, a little surprised, but said nothing at first. The woman smiled calmly, unfazed by the cold atmosphere. Once she was allowed to speak, she did something no one expected. She looked directly at the young man and asked him if he could explain what happened during his arrest. At first, the teenager was nervous. It wasn't easy standing there, eyes watching every move. But then, he remembered everything he had learned over the years. How the police had treated him unfairly. How they hadn't read his rights. How they had jumped to conclusions with clear words. He began to tell the story, not just as a scared kid, but as someone who understood the law. He spoke about his rights, about what should have happened but didn't. His voice was steady, his points sharp. The courtroom fell quiet. Even the judge's smirk disappeared for a moment. The lawyer carefully asked questions that showed the holes in the police's story. She pointed out how no evidence connected him to the crime. She reminded the court about mistakes and how the case was handled. Step by step, she built a picture that made it impossible to believe the young man was guilty. People who had laughed earlier looked down. The public defender began to sit up straighter, clearly surprised. Witnesses were called who confirmed the young man's location at the time of the crime. The whole case started to fall apart. At one point, the judge interrupted with a sharp comment, questioning the young man's knowledge of legal rights. "How does a boy like this even know what an attorney does?" he said, laughing quietly under his breath. The young man didn't react. He just waited for the right moment. When it finally came, the volunteer lawyer asked him to explain how he knew so much about the law. With humility and pride, he told them about the books he had read, the hours spent at the library, in the community center where he learned from lawyers who believed in him. His story wasn't just about himself. It was about a desire to help others who faced the same struggles. It was about fighting a system that often didn't care. It was about hope. The judge looked uncomfortable. He stopped laughing. He was used to people who didn't question authority, who accepted what was given to them. This young man was different. He was brave, smart, and determined. In the end, the charges were dropped. The judge said it was because there was no evidence. But those in the courtroom knew the truth was deeper, that this young man had broken through a wall of doubt with his own knowledge and courage. As he walked out of the courtroom, free for the first time in days, he felt something change inside. It wasn't just relief. It was a promise to himself. He would keep fighting, not just for his own freedom, but for everyone who didn't have a voice. If you want, I can prepare part 4 next. Would you like me to continue? Here's part 4 of your story, continuing with the same natural, clear, and human-centered tone. Years passed quickly. The young man who once stood in that courtroom as a scared teenager was now a young adult with a clear path ahead. After his case, something changed in how people saw him. Not everyone, but some began to notice that he wasn't just a kid from a tough neighborhood. He was someone with a real purpose. He worked hard in school, pushing himself every day. Sometimes it felt like the world was against him. But he remembered the long nights at the library, the worn-out books, and his mother's tired smile. He kept his promise to use what he had learned to make a difference. One day he received a letter that felt like a door opening. It was an acceptance letter to a university known for its law program. The scholarship inside meant he could go without worrying about money. It was a moment he'd dreamed about, but didn't fully believe would come true. At college, things were different. The classes were harder. The people from all over the country brought new ideas, and sometimes he felt out of place. But he never forgot where he came from or why he was there. He joined study groups, asked questions, and spent hours in the library again, this time with better resources and more support. He met mentors who encouraged him, who reminded him that his past didn't define his future. He found himself speaking up in class, sharing his experiences and learning how to argue cases with confidence. The boy who was once laughed at in court was now someone others looked up to. After graduating, he got into law school. The journey wasn't easy. There were times when the pressure felt overwhelming and moments of doubt. But every challenge made him stronger. He remembered the judge who laughed at him, the police who didn't listen, and the community that believed in him. Finally, after years of study, late nights, and sacrifices, he passed the bar exam. He was officially a lawyer. The day he walked into the courthouse again, it felt like coming home. But this time, he wasn't standing before a judge as a defendant. He was there as a defender, a person who could speak for those who had no voice, just like he once needed. The old courthouse was still the same worn building, but everything inside felt different. He wore a suit that fit well, carried a briefcase, and held his head high. He remembered the day he was called a boy who couldn't even spell attorney. Now, he was one. His first case was for a young boy from a neighborhood much like his own. The boy had been arrested unfairly, confused with someone else. As he prepared the defense, he felt a mix of emotions: pride, determination, and responsibility. He knew how much this moment meant. When the day of the trial arrived, he walked into the courtroom and saw the judge presiding. It was the same man who had laughed at him years ago. The judge looked surprised but said nothing. This time the roles were reversed. He presented the case with the knowledge and confidence he had earned. He cross-examined witnesses, pointed out mistakes, and spoke clearly about the boy's rights. The courtroom was silent, hanging on his every word. The judge didn't laugh. Instead, he listened. After the case was closed, the young lawyer left the courtroom with a sense of fulfillment. Justice had been served, but more than that, he had shown what was possible when someone refused to be defined by others' expectations. Later, the judge approached him quietly. There was no anger, no judgment, just a simple acknowledgement. "I was wrong about you," he said. The lawyer nodded. He didn't need to say more. His work wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about making sure justice was fair for everyone. Walking out of the courthouse, he looked ahead. There were many more battles to fight, many more lives to protect. But now he knew he had the power to change things. Not just for himself, but for every person who needed a voice in a world that too often tried to silence them. Would you like me to prepare the final part, part 5? Here's part 5 of your story, wrapping it up with a powerful, hopeful finish, still keeping the tone natural and human-focused. After that day in court, things didn't suddenly become easy for him. Life still had its challenges. The fight for justice is never simple or quick, but every case he took reminded him why he chose this path. He made it his mission to help young people who face the same struggles he once did. Kids from neighborhoods where opportunities were few and suspicion was high. Teens who felt like the system was stacked against them, who had nobody to stand up for them. He became a symbol of hope in his community, but he never forgot that hope had to be earned every single day. There were tough moments, losses, and times when it felt like the weight of the world was too much, but he stayed focused on the goal: fairness for those who often went unheard. Word spread about the young lawyer who had once been judged unfairly, but now fought fiercely for the innocent. People trusted him because he understood their pain, their fears, and their dreams. He listened more than he talked, and he never treated anyone like they were less than human. The judge who once laughed at him watched quietly as the years went by. Over time, he started to change too. Maybe it was seeing the young man's dedication or hearing stories from others in the courtroom. Slowly, the judge began to question some of his own beliefs. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult trial, the judge asked to speak with the lawyer privately. There was no audience, no pressure, just two men who had been on opposite sides years ago. "I was wrong about you," the judge said again, this time with more feeling. "You've shown me something important, that people can surprise us, that we shouldn't judge someone by where they come from or how they look." The lawyer smiled softly. "It's not about being right or wrong," he said. "It's about learning, about making sure everyone gets a fair chance." They shook hands, not as enemies, but as two men who had found respect in a place where it had once seemed impossible. For the young lawyer, this moment wasn't the end, it was a reminder. There was still so much work to do. More young people to defend, more unfairness to fight, more voices to raise. He looked out the courthouse window and thought about the future. A future where justice was truly blind, where everyone was treated with respect, and where no child would be laughed at just for dreaming big. He stepped back into the courtroom, ready to keep fighting. Not just for himself, but for all those who needed someone to believe in them. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stand up and show the world you belong, no matter what anyone else says. If you want, I can help you polish or expand any part, or format it for YouTube narration or articles. Just let me know.